Is it just because I'm approaching the age where I'll start to develop wrinkles, or is beauty becoming a big deal?
I am doing a skincare video.
So in terms of my skincare, I like to keep it super simple.
Men's skincare.
We're going to be doing a makeup routine on this look.
I'm going to take you through my daily skin routine.
No matter whether you're a man or a woman, the beauty industry is slowly settling into most of our homes, encouraging us to take better care of our skin and bodies and challenge irreversible aging. But it's not only about the consumers. The cosmetics industry is a key driver of Europe's economy. Europe is a dominant cosmetics exporter, and this sector thus provides significant employment to the continent's workers. But how well do we know the products we apply to our skin and the laws that regulate them? Welcome to Euronews Tech Talks, the podcast that explores the digital, technological, and scientific landscape shaping Europe. I'm your host, James Thomas. Today we continue our journey into the world of microplastics. After answering your questions on the topic in episode 73, we now dive into a specific aspect of microplastics, their presence in beauty and cosmetics products, and the regulations surrounding them. If you think this episode is exclusively for women or people who follow a 4-step skincare routine, I'm going to stop you right there. Men are also included in the conversation, even if they don't practice skincare, as certain products we use after shaving might also contain microplastics. But what's the relationship between beauty products and microplastics, and are there laws regulating this link? To answer these questions, our podcast producer, Alice Carnevali, sat down with 2 experts, a chemist and a lawyer. And here's how the conversation went.
Iseult Lynch, environmental chemist and professor at the University of Birmingham, and Hélène Duguy, environmental lawyer for the NGO Client Earth. Thanks for joining us on Euronews Tech Talks.
Thank you for the invitation to join.
Hello, thank you so much.
To start and to bring those who didn't listen to our first episode on microplastic up to speed, Iseult, could you briefly and very simply remind us what microplastics are?
So microplastics are the very small pieces of plastic, and they can either be created at the micro scale, which is for microplastics kind of considered from about 5 millimeters downwards, or more typically they are what we consider the secondary ones, where they are the breakdown of larger pieces of plastic in the environment, typically because we are not managing those wastes properly. So they are pretty much everywhere, and they are very small pieces of plastic that can get to places that the larger pieces can't.
These tiny plastic particles can be found everywhere in a wide range of products. For instance, for many years they were used in cosmetics. In which cosmetic products are or were microplastics previously added, and why were they added to these cosmetics?
The first time most people would have heard of microplastics was as microbeads. So these microbeads were typically in facial scrubs, body washes, and also maybe in toothpaste to give that sort of abrasive feeling so that, you could clean things effectively. And they were considered to be rinse-off products. And those ones have been phased out. So that's where most people consider them. But that really only dealt with the rinse-off cosmetics. So there's a whole other class of cosmetics and personal care products that are considered to be leave-on, because you leave them on your skin for a longer period. And there are still intentionally added microplastics in many of those products.
And these leave-on are, for instance, makeup products?
Exactly. Nail varnishes, long-lasting lipsticks, long-lasting face creams, but also, even moisturizers and things like that. So it's not only a women problem, is the point I want to make, that these products affect everybody.
We'll see later that these microplastics, as you said before, have been banned and companies are phasing out. But before we get to the regulation, why were they banned? What impact do microplastics in cosmetics have on the environment and also on the human health? Is there a danger related to that?
Plastics themselves are known to be relatively inert, so they're not that reactive. But the challenge with plastics is the additives in them largely. So things are added to those plastics to make them moldable, to make them usable. So they often will have what are called plasticizers. So they also have colorants in them, depending on the application that they're being designed for. They may have PFAS in them. So it's not always the plastic itself that's the problem. It's the additives associated with plastic that are, in many cases, the challenges for human health. In the environment, the fact that they shouldn't be there and the fact that we're finding microplastics, even very, very pristine environments where we wouldn't expect there to be evidence of human activity. So even in sort of the snow melt from the Himalayas, for example, or the salt that's mined and then appears on our table, they can also contain microplastics. So it's the fact that we are being exposed to these things that were never really intended for internalization.
PFAS are these toxic chemicals that are also known as forever chemicals. Are PFAS a concern when we talk about microplastics in cosmetic products?
With PFAS, they are typically not generally added to these products. So they're not on the list of approved chemicals. But because they might be in some of the grease or some of the other things that are used in the equipment, there is a risk that that small amounts might get in. And there have been some studies where they took cosmetics from the shelf and measured them. And in some cases, traces of PFAS are found. But I would say, they are definitely not intentionally added to these products.
And on the 25th of September 2023, the European Commission adopted the Commission Regulation EU 2023-2055, which is basically a proposal restricting the intentional use of microplastic in certain cosmetic products that Iseult before mentioned. Hélène, the organization you work for, Client Earth, was at the forefront, we can say, of the campaign for this restriction. So could you explain us in simple terms, sum up what this regulation is about and how did we get to it?
I think Iseult very well explained that. So we have two types of microplastics, the primary microplastics, which are those that are intentionally added into products, and we have the secondary forms of microplastic that's detached, let's say, from plastics. And so this restriction we're talking about really deals with the first primary microplastics. So in a way, the avoidable pollution, because we know that a lot of those microplastics could not be present in those products in the first place, because in many cases, they're not necessary. That's also why the European Union started working on this restriction, which is quite remarkable in the sense that it's the broadest restriction that we've had in Europe on chemicals, because it targets a huge group of polymers, so of those chemicals, which is a first. But so here we're really talking about banning microplastics that are intentionally added into products. Let's say that this restriction is not just about cosmetics, it's about all uses of microplastics. This restriction was actually mostly about microplastics in sport pitches, in fertilizers, in detergents. So just to say that cosmetics was just one of the uses that's been targeted by this restriction. It was a very long process in the EU. Those restrictions, they take quite a lot of time. A lot of microplastics are still allowed to be used in cosmetics because the restriction puts forward several transition periods depending on the type of cosmetics we're talking about. So the rinse-off products gets a shorter transition period than the leave-on products. And makeup is actually a specific category because they get a very long derogation periods compared to the other ones.
Industries, as you said, are now in this transition period to phase out microplastic in cosmetics. How is this transition going?
It's one of first of its kind as a restriction, and it's a big issue is the enforcement, because now the matter is basically in the hands of the member states, who have to make sure that companies comply with the restriction. And this has, of course, a lot of difficulties. And so what has happened since 2023 is that the European Commission launched a process of adopting a guidance that would basically clarify the definitions within the restriction, the scope, the different enforcement questions related to, how to check and control at site. So it's been a complicated process. And I know that some member states have been struggling with that. It's also important to remind ourselves that this restriction is not just about a ban. It's also about reporting requirements, labeling requirements, instructions of use and disposal. So many things that companies have to implement. And for the enforcement authorities, it's quite a challenge to put that into motion. So the guidance has been adopted, and now member states are in the process of getting familiar with that and implementing it.
So now we're in this transitional period. So basically it means that still some of the products we have at home, some of the products that we use for our skincare routine, they still contain microplastics, basically.
Yes, they still contain microplastics, and a lot of them are still going to contain microplastic for a long time. Also because the restriction is really mostly about placing on the markets. And so companies are still going to be able to use the remaining stock that they have. So microplastics are still going to be around for a while. Also, as I mentioned before, some of the leave-on products, especially the lip, the nail, and the makeup products, they got a 12-year derogation period. And that means that a lot of makeup products are still going to contain microplastic for a while.
And Iseult, I see you nodding while Hélène is talking. Do you maybe have anything to add?
It will be a long time that these products are still containing microplastics unless there is a really strong pushback from consumers, because again, consumers are a really powerful group. Consumer voice is very strong. And we have seen many other examples of where if consumers are choosing not to purchase things, or companies are declaring themselves to be microplastic free and can verify that through testing, then that might drive consumer behavior as well. And consumer behavior can drive company behavior too.
So companies have to label, and when they don't, obviously there should be sanctions. So there is a role for consumers to raise that. But I think there is also an important need to hold those companies accountable. And here it's mostly for governments to really act on their enforcement obligations. But what Isa mentioned about alternative providers or like companies who've been replacing microplastics in their products or who've been since the beginning microplastic free, there are a lot of them. And they were very active during the process, basically bringing evidence of the fact that there are many products that can be produced without microplastics. And it shouldn't be for consumers to look for safe products. It should be normal to enter a supermarket and choose a cream or a toothpaste that won't hurt you or won't pose a problem to your body and your health on the long term.
So Hélène said that some companies are already replacing microbeads, microplastics with other elements. So Iseult, are there any effective alternative to microplastic in cosmetics? And if so, what are they?
Microplastics are added for a number of reasons. And one of them is sort of that smoothness and spreadability of the cream. But they've also been used, for example, in anything that has sort of a glittery formation. So anything that has sort of a sparkle has often been microplastics. But of course, before we had microplastics, there were ways to do this. So mica is an example. There are now sort of bio-based versions of mica or of glitter and things like that. And many of the alternatives that are being developed that are instead of being extracted or produced from as a byproduct of petroleum, we are now increasingly seeing bio-based polymers. So things coming from plants. So there certainly are alternatives. And one of the challenges, I think, is understanding why they're there and what purpose they're having, and therefore what alternative materials can be used to achieve that same purpose.
So Hélène, now we're 3 years since this important restriction. What is the situation? You've already said that we are in a transitional period, but is this regulation at risk?
It's hard to tell as of now whether the market is really embracing this change. As of now, I think it's a little bit early in the process. And as I mentioned, there have been already some enforcement questions and implementing issues that are in the course of being solved. So let's hope this goes in the right direction. And I guess we'll know pretty soon how the market is responding to that. So that's the first question. Then whether it's at risk, I don't think so. I think now this restriction has been adopted. It's setting an impressive precedent also for future restrictions of chemicals. And now we are looking at other groups of chemicals like PFAS, which are following a little bit the same pattern, because What's led to the adoption of the restriction on microplastic in the first place was the environmental persistence. So basically the accumulation of those microplastics into the environment. This is the main concern that led regulators to look into this matter. And we have a similar issue with PFAS. So in a way, microplastic has been the first trial case for other chemicals that are similarly persistent and that need to be handled as a group, because obviously it wouldn't work to deal polymer per polymer, like substance by substance. We need restrictions that are comprehensive enough to be able to address the risk in a sufficiently constructive and effective way.
And Iseult, what are your thoughts on what Hélène has just said?
I agree completely that this is a really, really important first step and that it does set a really important precedent. It's interesting that you mentioned the persistence as being the driver, because I think that's also one of the big challenges in terms of alternative polymers as well, is making sure that they don't, if we design them to degrade faster, does that just mean we get the microplastics faster? Or how do we make sure that they degrade all the way and don't stop at the micro and even smaller nanoplastics? So how we get them all the way back to bioavailable fractions that can be reused or repurposed. But yeah, I think assessing things on the basis of an entire class of chemicals is definitely the way forward.
Iseult Lynch and Hélène Duguy, thank you for joining us on Euronews Tech Talks.
That was our podcast producer, Alice Carnevali, interviewing environmental chemist Iseult Lynch and environmental lawyer Hélène Duguy. As you can see, the answer to whether the products we apply to our skin contain microplastics is, it depends. Companies in the EU are currently in a transitional period as they work to phase out microbeads. So maybe yes, the products sitting on your bathroom shelves still contain microplastics, or perhaps no, they don't. Of course, you can always try to check their labels, but don't be surprised if you don't spot the word microplastic. Companies will be bound to show the statement, "This product contains microplastics," only from 2031. So for now, labels could still be full of cryptic chemical jargon that's tricky to detect. That's it for today's episode of Euronews Tech Talks. We'll be back in 2 weeks with the last episode about microplastics and also the last episode of this year's season before the summer break. Next time, we'll take you to the Flanders Marine Institute on the Belgian coast to learn more about marine microplastic pollution. I'm your host, James Thomas. This series was created by Marta Rodriguez Martinez. This episode was written and produced by Alice Carnevali. The theme music is by Léo Lebrun. Sound editing and sound mixing is by Joanne Breton. Our editor-in-chief is Niaz Samadizada. If you aren't already, you can listen to this series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Castbox, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider leaving us a positive review and, of course, sharing it. Thanks for listening.